Thank you very much for having us again. As you said, it's not the first time that we are here. GCSP, I'm really glad that this year this is the first, really the start of the contact with an audience for the launch of the Global Terrorism Index. We are basically here twice a year when we launch the Global Peace Index in June and the Global Terrorism Index in November. So the Institute for Economics and Peace is an independent, apolitical and non-for-profit think tank with headquarters or main office in Sydney, Australia, and we dedicate our work to identify and quantify and measure the drivers of peace and also the economic benefits that are linked to a more peaceful situation. So as said, main office in Sydney. We have an office in New York connecting with the UN headquarters over there. I'm heading the office in Brussels, responsible for Europe and the MENA region. We have a small office in The Hague that is looking at consultancy opportunities within Europe. We have a representation in Mexico City that is linked to the New York office, because every year we also produce a national index in Mexico called the Mexico Peace Index that is looking at safety and security within this society, and we just opened about a year ago an office in Harare to support our efforts in positive peace with the government of Zimbabwe. So we interact a lot with international organizations, and we also produce research for those organizations. That's why I kind of start to know Geneva very well and exchange it with a lot of institutions also here, and that's also the reason why IAP decided to open office in Brussels about a couple of years ago. Our work is included in a lot of university courses, and there is a running joke at the main office that says that when the server is down, a lot of university professors get nervous because they need to access our research to be able to teach also classes on peace and development. We have a lot of downloads of IAP reports in the last year. About 200,000 reports have been downloaded. We have a global media reach of about 7 billion. It always fluctuates between 7 and 10 billion. So basically, our piece of IAP research is read about 7 to 10 billion times a year. So next to the research that we produce, we also have a large effort on promoting it. That's why I'm here today. And we have about 1 billion followers, so at least people who like what we do on social media also. We are represented to at least, we have an outreach in about 150 countries. We do a lot of work with IAP ambassadors, so mostly those are people that are already investing in civil society initiatives, already working in peace, and that then connect with IAP. For example, with those ambassadors, I will do 3 Skype launches in the coming days. Tomorrow with Lagos and Nigeria, on Thursday in Cameroon with the university in Cameroon, and on the 13th of December in Haiti. A lot of book references also, so people like to use our research in their own publications and in their own consultancy, and we have a lot of 1.5 million unique visitors as of today on our website. So next to the research, we also do a lot of promotion. So the Global Terrorism Index, so it's one of the publications we produce. We produce about 10 publications a year. 4 main publications: the Global Peace Index, as said in June. Linked to this, the Positive Peace Index, the Global Terrorism Index, and also publication on the cost of violence, where we basically put a figure on what violence costs the world on a yearly basis. And those are mind-blowing figures. This is the 7th year that we produce the Global Terrorism Index. So we have identified terrorism, which is one of the 23 indicators we use for the Global Peace Index, as one, when it fluctuates, that had a large impact on the overall Global Terrorism Index. And that is why, before the peak of the current wave of terrorism, the 4th wave of terrorism, we started to produce a specific report on this type of violence. We rank 160 countries. The remaining 30 are too small for a statistical base, or too small in size or territory or size of the population. We analyze the relative impact of terrorism. So it's clear to us that an attack in Brussels, for example, as we experienced in 2016, can have an impact that is completely different. And please do not get me wrong here. I'm not like classifying potential impact on potential societies, but it's clear that in an environment that is deemed to be very secure or almost 100% secure, when you get targeted, the impact is completely different than, for example, a country that is in conflict that is also experiencing terrorism. I said it's an indicator of the peace index. We develop the index ourselves, and it's overseen by an international panel of experts. The methodology, I think it's pretty clear. We start with a definition. This is a definition that is used to collect the data. So the START consortium at the University of Maryland is establishing the Global Terrorism Database, and to be able to do so, to be able to collect data, you need to start with this definition of terrorism, that is the use of illegal force and violence by non-state actors to attain a political, economic, religious or social goal through fear, coercion or intimidation. We are in the field of social sciences, political sciences, so we do not have a globally accepted definition of terrorism, so this is why we needed to start with one. So we collect the data. Once we have the data, we push it through the filter of 4 indicators: the number of incidents, the number of victims, so death and injury, and also the property to damage. Each of those indicators receive a certain weight. We identify terrorism as a more persistent form of violence, and therefore also keep within the indexes that we produce, I would say, the half-life or the half-value of the year before, and that over a period of 5 years. So that's why, for example, in Europe or in the EU, maybe for the last time, but in the EU, the UK is still the most impacted country, ranking 30 on the index, followed by France, ranking 36, followed by Belgium. Although France had 12 casualties last year, Belgium had 4, but this remaining impact of the past 5 years is the cause for the UK being still the most impacted country within the EU. Of course, we do our statistical work. We introduce also socio-economic indicators, and this is producing the Global Terrorism Index. So after this introduction, let's go to the results directly. On our website called visionofhumanity.org, you have access to an interactive map that is giving you access also to all the data that we use to produce the index. So you can click on each of those countries and get all the data, all the ranking, wider ranking, and access to what you need to know. That was basis for the analysis that we produce. Countries in green, and it's only 26 on the index, did not have any attack in the past 5 years, and therefore have a very low score, and all the same score for those 26 countries. The countries most impacted by terrorism in 2019, so you get basically the bottom 10 of the index, but as it is a negative approach, I would say they top the ranking. This is the first time since 2003, so more than almost 15-16 years, that Iraq is not the most impacted country. This is the first time that we see Afghanistan at the bottom of the index, and there is no surprise to see that Afghanistan is also at the bottom of a peace index and a positive peace index. So in this country, 50% of all deaths by terrorism fell in Afghanistan last year. Out of the 4 most prolific terrorist groups in the world, 2 are active in Afghanistan. Number 1, for the first time, the Taliban, who killed more than 6,100 persons last year. And the 3rd most prolific terrorist group in the world, the Khorasan chapter of ISIS, killed more than 1,200 persons. So Taliban alone, 38% of all casualties by terrorism last year. Those 2 groups together, so in Afghanistan, close to 50% of all casualties last year. And what is so specific is that those 2 groups are only active in 1 country. So when we had ISIL before, that was number 1 most prolific, they were active in an entire region and even in several regions and creating mayhem in those several regions. Those 2 groups are only active in 1 country. The key findings, so we saw a decrease last year of the impact of terrorism by 15%. And this is aggregated over the past 4 to 5 years, so since the peak in 2014. This is the 4th decrease in a row, and a total of 52% lower impact of terrorism today than we had when we had the peak in 2014. 98 countries improved compared to 40 who deteriorated, so that's good. The bad news, I would say, and this is in contradiction to this decrease of the impact, is that terrorism is still a global issue. 71 countries suffered at least 1 death in 2018. This is the 2nd highest number of countries impacted by terrorism in the past decade. So this means that we see that The large terrorist groups have been targeted, and therefore the capabilities to impact us are now lower, and therefore we have a decrease of the impact of terrorism. But the basic, the fundamental ideas, the fundamental causes of the phenomenon called terrorism are still there. We also saw that by crushing the Islamic State in the MENA region, you clearly had a redistribution of their combat forces, so to speak, to other regions. And in the same sheet last year, I was talking about 3 regions, and that would have been South Asia, with, of course, a focus on Afghanistan, Pakistan. And we saw the results this year. I spoke about Sub-Saharan Africa, and we see that in the top 10 most impacted countries, we find countries back like Mali, we see Burkina Faso coming in, we even see a country like Mozambique that is entering this top 10 also, which is quite disturbing. And I would say the third region that we had identified was Nigeria, a country in which we saw, again, a rise in the impact of terrorism, and more than 2,000 people being killed in this country in the past years. So I said all this, the amount of death down in Europe, 70% to 62 last year. Turkey, in all our indexes, is considered in the European group. So out of those 62, we saw that 40 of those casualties fell in Turkey last year. I spoke about this. So this is an increase by 71% for the Taliban. It's almost like communicating boxes, I would say. You see ISIL having a decrease by 70% in the amount of casualties they produce, and on the other end you see Taliban having an increase of 70% of the amount of casualties they produced last year. I said 30% of all terrorist deaths. Afghanistan most affected. Iraq, Nigeria, Syria and Pakistan are completing the top 5%. What we also saw, and this is only in Western Europe, or I would say in Europe, Northern America and Oceania, we saw, and for this is now the 5th or the 6th year in a row, we see an increase of the phenomenon of far-right terrorism. So when you look at the figures, of course you could say there is an increase by 320% in 5 years, so that's a lot. But still in figures, this is super marginal in figures compared to the overall figures of terrorism. We spoke about 26 casualties last year, but we already speak this year about 79 casualties. So we counted 77 until the end of September. Of course, with 50 to 51, only one attack in Christchurch in March this year. And I personally added the 2 casualties from this attack on the synagogue in Halle in Germany in October. And we were very lucky there that, I would say, Germans produced strong doors. Otherwise, we would have had a lot more casualties. So in figures, marginal, but it's very localized. It's, of course, linked to political developments. And you see a clear, I would say, a strong increase of the past 5 years, both in the number of incidents and also in the number of casualties. I said 77, it's already 79 right now. We clearly see that the figures overall have been decreasing, but you also see in this figure that some of the countries increase, and that's the case for Nigeria and Afghanistan. All right, so this is the death from terrorists by country. So I said close to 50% fell in Afghanistan, followed by Nigeria and other countries that I already spoke about. So you clearly see a concentration of this evil in the Middle East, Northern Africa still, in South Asia with, of course, a focus on Pakistan, Afghanistan, and then Sub-Saharan Africa, the 3 regions that I spoke about before. The rises and fallers, so very good news for Iraq. That's a little bit also repeating what we saw last year with Syria. When we look at Iraq and Somalia, this is clearly linked to the intervention of the international community. So we all know about the international coalition against Daesh in Syria and Iraq. For Somalia, these are targeted airstrikes by the United States. But again, tackling the capacities to harm, but not taking away the root causes of the phenomenon. The rises for there, I already spoke about Afghanistan, Nigeria. Look at Mali, Mozambique, Burkina Faso. I would say those are the next victims of this spreading evil. Every year, in every index we produce, we try to put an economic figure also on the impact of terrorism. So this is also going down. I mean, if you have a decrease by 15% of the impact, of course, you will have also a decrease by on the economic impact. This is about 33 billion. I explained to you before that we are producing every year this document on the cost of violence. The overall cost of violence worldwide, it's about 14.1 trillion, which is about 11.2% of the world GDP. So, of course, 33 billion might sound a very large amount or a very high amount, but compared to the overall cost of violence, I think it's, it's not so representative, so to speak, but still, it's 33 million too much. When we look at the trend, so basically when we open the time window, we clearly see the peak we had in 2014, a peak of terrorism, and after that a decrease. So there are two ways to look at this graph. First way is to look at every time this graph is changing direction, when the flux is changing, you could basically also link this to the effects of decision in foreign policy, either intervention, non-intervention, acceptable, legal, legitimate intervention, or I would say unacceptable, illegitimate, and illegal interventions in some other countries. I said intervention and non-intervention. I would say that all those effects of foreign policy on certain regions of the world, you will see a clear impact on this graph. The second question you can ask yourself is, like, when you look at those figures, are we really did we tackle the problem of terrorism, and are we going to really solve it in the coming years, or is this just like another sub-phase in this overall phase? And are we going to face other type of terrorism in the future? And are we going to maybe to face other type of enemies in the future? And maybe the last question regarding this slide: are we going to create new windows of opportunities for new leaders and new groups to emerge and impact us in the future? I spoke about the most deadliest groups, so you clearly see the yellow and red. So this is ISIL and Boko Haram. This is a clear consequence of international military action against those groups. The coalition in Syria and Iraq, but also in northeast Nigeria, the Nigerian Defense Forces, supported also by a multinational joint task force for the Lake Chad Basin, that is basically stopping the Boko Haram from getting out of northeast Nigeria and getting resources outside of Nigeria. Therefore, on the other hand, we see a clear and steady increase of the impact of these two groups I spoke about before in Afghanistan. The distribution of death by terrorism, so this is clearly following the slide that I showed before, and you clearly see the amount of countries impacted. I spoke to you before about the decrease of the impact of terrorism since the peak of 2014. So I invite you to have a look at the last 5 years on this slide, and you will see this, those are the all-time high in the amount of countries that have been impacted. So it's clearly showing that there is also a trend over a longer period of time of the spread of the phenomenon, but therefore also a diminution of or decrease of the impact. The economic impact over the years, so this is also clearly following the slide that I showed before, with a very special event in 2001. That would be the outbound data for this graph. By region, I think this is very important. So I clearly spoke about those three regions before, and the amount of death and the amount of incidents also. And this is a slide where I have two more remarks to give. Is clearly when we speak about terrorism impact in Europe, terrorism impact in the West, please have a look at the position of North America on this slide, on this graph, and also Europe. And I will explain to you later the two main drivers of. I can do it now. The two main drivers of terrorism, or the two main drivers of terrorism. 95% of all terrorist attacks occur in a country that is engaged in a violent conflict. So there is at least one violent conflict happening on the territory of this country. And the other driver of terrorism is the use of political terror towards your own population. And if you combine those two main factors, this represents 99% of all terrorist attacks throughout the world. There is a clear correlation between violent conflict, and the use of terrorism, and there is also a clear correlation, I will show you with slides afterwards and graphs afterwards, between death by combat and death by terrorism. There is a clear correlation between those two. And when you look at the conflicts we are facing today, most of those conflicts have an insurgents base. Those conflicts were internal conflicts that got internationalized for most of them, and by getting internationalized got more intense and lasted longer. But within insurgency it's 4 phases, and the third phase of an insurgency, it's always terrorism, the use of terrorism. And therefore you clearly have this correlation, the PICO. That's at least one of the explanations you could give to the correlation between those both effects. But therefore, if you take these 2 drivers, if you keep them in the back of your mind, I don't think they apply to the EU countries, so European countries, of most of the European countries. And so therefore, claiming that we have a terrorist crisis in Europe, it's true, because we are the most peaceful region of the world, and we are very secured society. So when we get targeted, the perception of vulnerability is much higher, but the real impact of terrorism is somewhere else in the world, clearly. Far-right terrorism, maybe a couple of more words about this. So you clearly see an increase of the incidence in far-right terrorism in the world, and I gave you the figures that this year, the figures of this year are already higher than last year. Political terrorism in the West, so we see that we had much more far-left incidents, but far-right was more effective, I would say. So far-right produced more casualties, but far-left produced more incidents over the years. And this is also a good graph bringing us back to the 70s and the 80s, so where you can see that terrorism as we know it today, both influenced by an ideology or both influenced by a political ideology, are not new phenomena. We have faced them in the past, and I would even say that the impact that we see today is much lower than the impact that we saw 3 to 4 decades ago. Again, another slide to really show you that this political terrorism has increased in the past decade. So you open the time window and you see, of course, that the impact was larger before, but you see a strong increase of this political terrorism in the past decade. A difference between, I would say, the main effect of terrorist groups in the world today and this far-right approach is that far-right is basically today a narrative that is promoted politically, a narrative that is promoted online, and a narrative that is picked up by a certain type of people. I think that they will need to use violence to get into the action mode and really operationalize the narrative that is produced. Therefore, you do not identify at the moment really those organized terrorist groups that will start claiming those attacks and that will start really develop a strategic plan around the use of politically motivated terrorism. So that's a clear difference to groups like IS, for example, like the Taliban or like Al-Qaeda. So there is a clear difference there, the affiliation and claiming the attacks by a larger group. Another phenomenon that we have noticed over a larger time window is that what is usually called a mass shooting, and I think there we are moving towards the West and towards Northern America, more and more, even if the percentage is still low, more and more mass shootings are now identified as being terrorist attacks. So this means that more and more of those mass shootings and the motivations and the modus operandi that are linked to mass shootings today fit the definition that we use to collect the data for as a terrorist attack. I will pass this one for today. Conflict and terrorism. This is where I'm going to try to make the link between armed conflict and terrorism. When look at those two graphs. This is showing you the evolution of battle death, so people dying in combat, but also the evolution of people, the amount of people getting killed by terrorism. And you clearly see a correlation in the graph between those two phenomena. So this is a first approach where we can link battle death and death from terrorism. Now, when you look at the conflict type, you will see that the most intense conflicts are going to produce the largest use of terrorism and also, therefore, also the largest impact of terrorism within combat. All right, so these are armed conflicts in which terrorism is used as a tactic, procedure, a technique within combat. So it's just another choice by military commanders or insurgency commanders. This is a type of violence they're going to use to attain their goals. And the more intense the conflict, the more terrorism will be used and the more deadly it will be. The targets of terrorism, I think this is really interesting also, because this is pointing even more into the direction of what I said before. So we clearly see that the main targets for terrorist groups in those conflict-affected regions would be the police and the military, and also, I would say, other terrorist groups, and also then private citizens and property. So you clearly see that the goal of those groups using terrorism into their combat is to destabilize an existing governance, and also to taking away every basis of this governance in a country. And just try to analyze what the Taliban have been doing over the years, and especially intensifying this year, and you will clearly see that this is the goal: undermining existing governments, undermining existing governance effects, and trying to, of course, become the next government in this country. You also see that, for example, and this is a figure that when you look at tourists not really being targeted anymore, we had an example of this before, but when you also see the businesses not being targeted, I think this is even reinforcing this idea of a group that thinks to be the future leaders, and therefore you need to, when you take over governance in a certain country, you need to make sure that you did not destroy everything. You still have a basis you can build on with your own system, in your own future system. Gender and terrorism, we also established a link between this, where we clearly saw a large increase in the use of, I would say, women as suicide bombers, as terrorists, and the concentration of this in Nigeria. So Boko Haram identified the use of female as terrorist perpetrators in the past years, and we saw an increase of this, and 80% of this phenomenon is really located in Nigeria with Boko Haram. We also noticed a reaction by the defense forces that now identified this type of potential perpetrators, and therefore we saw the effect of this new tactic being decreased over the past years. In Afghanistan, the same type of there's an hybrid form of this violence, where male perpetrators would just wear a burqa for not being recognized, and therefore could access more easily, as you see, the most liked type of targets, which are marketplaces, plazas and squares, followed by, I would say, indiscriminate group of people. So we saw a clear connection there, and we see the preferred targets of this type of terrorism also. So I guess I tried to be as fast as possible, to also leave the floor to my two colleagues, but especially to answer your questions afterwards. So those were the results of the Global Terrorism for this year. Thank you for being here today, and thank you again for giving me the opportunity to present the research of the Institute for Economics and Peace. Thank you.